General Hospital spoilers for next week, from August 4th to August 8th, reveal that Willow never imagined that breaking away from Drew would trigger a spiral of manipulation, obsession, and psychological warfare that now threatens every corner of her existence. What once masqueraded as regret in Drew's eyes has mutated into something far more sinister, an unrelenting need for control disguised as concern. A calculated obsession cloaked in whispers of reconciliation. Willow thought she had escaped the worst of it when she ended their engagement, hoping to rebuild a peaceful life with her children, free from the shadows of Drew's betrayal. But in truth, that decision merely ignited the darkest side of the man she once trusted. Now, Willow is caught in a twisted battle with a man who refuses to accept that she no longer belongs to him, and who will stop at nothing to maintain power over her emotional and psychological state. In public, Drew continues to present himself as the wounded party, the grieving fiancé, the misunderstood father figure, the noble hero still aching for forgiveness. But behind closed doors, Willow sees the cracks forming in his polished facade. He knows her weaknesses, her fears, and most chillingly, the secrets she hoped no one would ever uncover. Among those secrets is the truth about Sasha's disappearance and the terrifying role Willow played in tailing Daisy. Drew holds that truth like a loaded weapon, ready to aim it at Willow the moment she dares to challenge him. He doesn't need to raise his voice or make threats, his silence, his knowledge, his quiet reminders of her past mistakes are more effective than any overt act of violence. It's a slow suffocation, and Willow is gasping for air. Her world is unraveling. Wiley and Amelia are no longer safely within her reach, not just because of court orders or Drew's influence, but because Drew has seeded doubt everywhere she turns. Carly, Michael, even the Corinthos family at large, all view Willow now with wary eyes, unsure whether she is truly stable, or if Drew's subtle campaign of mischaracterization has already taken root. He paints her as fragile, erratic, and emotionally unstable, especially after the explosive breakdown she suffered at the altar. But Willow knows the truth. Her reaction that day was not madness, but clarity. For the first time, she saw Drew for who he truly was. And now that she knows, he will do everything in his power to erase that version of her reality. Every interaction with Drew is a minefield. He drops hints about her past, poses questions that sound innocent but are laced with implication. "How is Daisy?" he'll ask with a smile. Or, "I hope you're not feeling watched," while brushing past her in the hallway. It's torment disguised as affection. And Willow is increasingly isolated, unable to convince others that the man they see as a victim is actually her captor in disguise. She feels the walls closing in, the weight of public perception pressing down, the judgment of Port Charles beginning to lean toward Drew. He has the resources, the charisma, and the connections, and she has a dress stained with tears and a reputation eroded by chaos. But Willow isn't weak. The heartbreak, the guilt, and the shame have forged something new inside her, determination. She begins to write everything down, every strange conversation, every veiled threat, every instance where Drew crosses lines others can't see. She documents it all, not because she expects justice to come quickly, but because she knows one day the truth will matter. And when that day comes, she'll be ready. Still, the pressure mounts. Drew begins suggesting that they reunite, not for love, but for the children. He manipulates the narrative, suggesting to Carly and Michael that Willow's deterioration stems from loneliness, from regret, from postpartum instability. He never directly insults her, instead, he allows concern to become its own kind of weapon. And when that doesn't work, he pivots to threats wrapped in civility. "I just want what's best for everyone," he says, holding her gaze a beat too long. The implication is clear: cooperate or suffer. The situation worsens when Drew discovers that Willow has been secretly meeting with Nina. Though their relationship is still fractured, Nina has offered quiet support, understanding the terror of being vilified by someone you once loved. Nina becomes an unexpected ally, which only enrages Drew more. He begins feeding stories to select allies, spinning narratives that make Willow appear unfit, irresponsible, and emotionally volatile. He wants full custody. Not because he loves Wiley and Amelia more, but because taking them from Willow is the ultimate form of domination. Now, even Willow's dreams are no longer safe. She wakes in the middle of the night, haunted by the image of Drew standing over her with that same quiet smirk, speaking softly while he dismantles her life piece by piece. Her world has become a battlefield where Drew plays both soldier and saboteur, and her only defense is the truth that no one else seems ready to believe. And yet, there is one thing Drew has underestimated: Willow's resolve. She may be cornered, may be gaslit, and may be painted as unstable, but she is not defeated. She begins to make her own moves. She consults with a private investigator, someone far outside Drew's circle of influence. She starts reaching out to people who knew Sasha, who might testify to the emotional damage inflicted by Drew's manipulations. She even risks confronting Carly, begging her to look past her loyalty to Drew and see what is truly happening. Carly, torn and conflicted, begins to question what she's been told. The seeds Willow plants begin to grow, slowly, subtly, but steadily. Even Michael, bound by guilt and confusion, finds himself remembering moments that didn't quite make sense, things Drew said, choices he made, the eerie confidence with which he operated even after Willow rejected him. The doubt is beginning to spread, and Drew senses it. That's when he tightens his grip, and the battle between them becomes a race, Willow trying to reveal the truth before Drew can destroy it. The pain, the terror, the gaslighting, it's all real. But so is the fire in Willow's heart. She knows this fight could cost her everything, but she also knows that submission would cost her soul. And as the storm builds, as Drew becomes more reckless, more desperate, more exposed, Willow readies herself for the final confrontation. It's no longer about love lost or children shared. It's about truth. It's about liberation. And in that truth, Willow finds her strength, not just to survive, but to rise. And one day, when the ashes of Drew's manipulation finally settle, Willow will still be standing. Bruised, perhaps. Changed forever, undoubtedly. But free. Jason was no stranger to shadows or secrets, but as he prepared to board a private flight to Dubrovnik, there was a restlessness within him that even he couldn't silence. Every instinct told him that something about Britt's disappearance was wrong, not final, not fatal, but orchestrated. The whispers he had heard, the fragmented clues left behind like breadcrumbs in the dark, all pointed to something more than coincidence. Now, with the confirmation of her ties to the Five Poppies resort and the sudden reappearance of Liesl in Port Charles at the exact moment he believed he saw Britt at the airport, Jason could no longer deny the pull. The mission was no longer just personal, it was urgent. And it was about more than closure. It was about truth. It was about life or death. Dubrovnik wasn't just a name on a map anymore. It had become the epicenter of a growing web of suspicion, manipulation, and silent warfare. As Jason studied the details of the luxury resort, masked beneath the guise of international research and diplomacy, he realized what he was walking into wasn't just a place of answers, it was a vault of dangerous knowledge. Britt hadn't just vanished. She had either been taken or had willingly inserted herself into something far beyond what anyone back in Port Charles had guessed. And if she was alive, Jason knew she might already be running out of time. The WSB had gone silent. Jason's usual back channels had dried up, and his inquiries were met with redacted reports and stone walls. That silence was louder than any confession. It meant someone powerful wanted this buried. But Jason had never backed away from impossible odds, especially when someone he cared about was in the crosshairs. The obsession he now carried wasn't born of romance or guilt. It was a relentless need to undo the injustice that had defined too much of his life, loss without reason, death without answers. Britt had died saving Jocelyn, or so they had believed. But now, that very rescue seemed more like a staged act of martyrdom, and the closer Jason looked, the clearer it became. Britt had been a player in a larger game all along. One that may have forced her to fake her death, or worse, forced her to disappear because the truth she possessed had become too dangerous to live with. As Jason packed his gear and secured his weapons, his mind raced through the growing list of enemies. Dalton stood out, cold, clinical, brilliant but immoral. His work in bioethics was known to be controversial, and Jason now believed that Britt had seen something in Dalton's files, something she couldn't unsee. Her departure from Port Charles hadn't been retreat, it had been a maneuver, a way to draw fire away from others and go deeper into the belly of the beast herself. But if that was true, if Britt had placed herself inside the storm for a higher cause, then Jason was already too late. Because someone like Dalton didn't allow secrets to survive long. If Britt had confronted him, exposed his work, or even merely threatened to blow the whistle, then her continued existence meant one of two things: either she was being kept alive for leverage, or she was being hunted like prey. Either way, her life was in immediate danger. What terrified Jason more was the possibility that Jocelyn was also compromised. Her connection to Britt, their mutual ties to the WSB, and her growing entanglement with Vaughn made her a pawn in this deadly game as well. Vaughn may have started as her partner in an intel mission, but Jason had begun to suspect the loyalties at play were much more fractured than they appeared. Jocelyn could be walking straight into a trap, one that Britt had tried to disarm alone. The flight to Dubrovnik would only take a few hours, but Jason knew the deeper he went, the more he risked. Britt's name alone was enough to raise red flags. But if he could locate the right room, the right hallway, the right file, he could prove once and for all that she hadn't died in Port Charles. That her life had been stolen, hijacked by an agency, a mission. Or perhaps even the people she thought she could trust. Jason wasn't just chasing a ghost, he was trying to save someone who had deliberately chosen to vanish to protect others. There were reports that someone matching Britt's description had been seen near the coastal perimeter of the resort 2 nights ago. A woman with a slight limp, a black jacket, and the unmistakable scar on her wrist. But there had been no footage. No identification. And just like that, she was gone again, like smoke fading into fog. Jason clung to that sighting like oxygen. If she had been there, it meant she was still moving, still alive. But for how long? Every detail of the upcoming mission felt heavier than usual. He wasn't just going in for recon, he was prepared to extract Britt, if she was still in one piece. He was prepared to fight the WSB if they stood in his way. He was prepared to unearth whatever Dalton was hiding, even if it meant returning to Port Charles with more than one enemy tracking his every move. Because the truth was too important. Only closed doors and locked rooms guarded by people trained to kill without question. But Jason had survived worse. And if Britt was out there, if her life was on the line, then nothing, not the WSB. Not Dalton, not even the Hell's Cape waiting in Dubrovnik, would stop him from bringing her home. Because something had gone wrong. Horribly wrong. And Jason knew, this was no longer a search. It was a rescue. And time was running out. Sidwell and Sunny were now standing at the edge of a war neither of them could avoid. And what began as a quiet tug-of-war for influence was rapidly transforming into an explosive collision of power, pride, and deeply buried vendettas. Sidwell, long regarded as a calculating puppet master who preferred to operate behind the scenes, was no longer content with whispers and shadows. His ambitions had grown teeth. And with every move Sunny made to protect his family and tighten his grip on Port Charles, Sidwell responded with equal intensity, unafraid to provoke or escalate. What was unfolding now was no longer about territory or revenge, it had become a battle for dominance, with each man representing opposing ideologies and generations of enmity. Sunny, hardened by decades of underworld survival, sensed the change in air the moment Sidwell returned to town with a new network of allies, cloaked in the illusion of legitimacy but steeped in coercion. Sidwell didn't just want power, he wanted to dismantle everything Sunny had built, brick by brick, starting with his credibility and control. This wasn't a typical mob turf dispute. This was psychological warfare, laced with personal history and old blood, and both men knew that only one of them would walk away standing tall. The tension had begun months ago. When Sidwell made quiet but dangerous inroads into Sunny's operations, first through business fronts, then through connections to international syndicates Sunny had carefully avoided. But now, with Jason occupied abroad and Dante pulled in multiple directions, Sunny found himself increasingly isolated, forced to rely on instincts and loyalty rather than raw firepower. Sidwell had anticipated that, and he played the long game masterfully, poisoning relationships and buying silence until Sunny no longer knew whom to trust. Now, all signs pointed toward an imminent confrontation. Sidwell's latest move suggested he was done playing behind closed doors. He had begun consolidating control in areas once sacred to Sunny, harbor routes, shipping manifests, and even courthouse informants. It was no longer a rumor, it was a siege. And Sunny, though furious, understood that this was not a war he could win with brute force alone. Sidwell had become smarter, more vicious, and far more connected than Sunny ever anticipated. What made the battle even more perilous was that Sidwell had begun reaching into Sunny's inner circle. Reports had surfaced of coded messages intercepted between Sidwell's men and corrupt city officials. Even more alarming were whispers that someone close to Sunny, perhaps even inside his household, was feeding Sidwell intel. Trust had become a fragile commodity. And Sunny knew that any wrong step could ignite the very collapse Sidwell was hoping for. But Sunny was not ready to fall. He had weathered storms before, betrayals, federal raids, and personal losses that would have shattered lesser men. What set him apart was not just his resilience, but his clarity in war. And now, as Sidwell pushed harder, Sunny began drawing the lines in blood. He called in old favors, reactivated dormant allies, and quietly put pressure on local figures who had forgotten just how deep his reach extended. The city may have changed, but Sunny had never stopped keeping score. Sidwell, for his part, welcomed the confrontation. He believed Sunny was weak, worn down by years of carrying the burdens of empire. Sidwell underestimated the fire that still burned in Sunny, the protective rage that ignited whenever his children, his community, or his legacy was threatened. That miscalculation would prove costly, because Sunny was preparing to strike in ways that Sidwell hadn't accounted for. What no one yet saw coming was the ripple effect. The war between Sidwell and Sunny wasn't just about power, it would drag in everyone close to them, Jason, Dante, Michael, Ava, even Christina. And in the crossfire would be secrets, betrayals, and truths that had remained buried for years. Sunny had always known the cost of war. But this time, it wasn't just about surviving, it was about making sure Sidwell never got the chance to rise again. As the final pieces moved into place, and both men took their positions, the city braced for what was coming. This wasn't just a power shift. This was scorched earth, and when the dust settled, Port Charles would never look the same again. Cody and Molly were now caught in the middle of a fresh wave of tension that neither of them had fully anticipated, and as the friction between them intensified, it became clear that this wasn't just a minor disagreement, it was the start of something far more volatile. Their strained dynamic was no longer a private matter. As the emotional fallout from past decisions and shifting alliances began to bleed into every conversation, every glance, every attempt at reconciliation, something had changed. And that change wasn't subtle, it was explosive. What once seemed like a manageable divergence in perspective had turned into a collision of principles, emotions, and unspoken resentments. Cody, who had tried to distance himself from the wreckage left by Christina's manipulations, found himself once again drawn into a web of chaos. His involvement with Molly had always been complicated, shadowed by loyalty to Christina and the lingering guilt over past deceptions. But now, with Molly increasingly unafraid to speak her mind and challenge his every motive, the space between them had become a battlefield. Their arguments, once quiet and restrained, were turning sharp, laced with the kind of anger that only comes from betrayal. Molly, for her part, had grown exhausted by Cody's moral ambivalence. Where she once saw him as someone who could change, who could rise above the mess, she now saw a man who was too entangled in Christina's orbit to see the destruction being left in her wake. Molly had always feared that Cody's inability to fully sever ties with Christina would lead to disaster, and now, those fears were being confirmed. The more she tried to confront him, the more defensive he became, as if acknowledging her concerns would force him to admit the truth he was still running from, that Christina's influence over him had never really ended. And while Cody and Molly's conflict raged, Christina was preparing for her own chaotic storm. Beneath her carefully curated image of reform and redemption, something far darker was festering. She had grown emboldened by recent events, her manipulation of Drew, her escalating attempts to control every narrative that threatened her, and now she was on the verge of unleashing something reckless. Christina wasn't just reacting, she was planning, calculating, and ready to detonate a new scandal that would shake everyone around her. Whatever lines had once existed between family and enemy, between right and wrong, had been blurred beyond recognition. The tension was reaching a boiling point. Molly had begun digging for answers, determined to expose whatever secret Christina was hiding, even if it meant confronting Cody again. She didn't trust him. Not entirely. And she couldn't afford to, not when Christina's next move could put them all at risk. Every interaction with Cody now felt like a test, a search for cracks in the truth. A way to determine whether he was protecting Christina or protecting himself. Cody, meanwhile, was struggling to stay neutral in a war that no longer allowed for silence. His feelings for Molly had never gone away, but the weight of everything he hadn't told her was suffocating. Every time he tried to come clean, Christina found a way to pull him back. To remind him of what was at stake if the truth came out. But deep down, Cody knew that his silence had become complicity. The longer he waited, the more damage he allowed to be done. Christina was ready. Whatever she had planned, it was coming fast, and she didn't care who got caught in the fallout. Molly, already burning with suspicion, wouldn't sit back. And Cody, trapped between the woman he loved and the sister who refused to be controlled, was running out of time. The fuse had been lit. And when the explosion came, it would leave no one untouched.